Welcome back to History in Ashes, where we dust off the past and bring you the stories that shaped the world you live in. Tonight, you and I are not in a quiet living room or a warm bed. No, we are floating in the cold silence above the Earth. The year is 1962. You can almost hear the faint hum of the life support systems through your helmet. A Soviet cosmonaut drifts in low orbit, and his spacecraft, one of the proud achievements of the Soviet Union, is experiencing a problem no one on the ground wants to talk about. Now, before we get deeper into the story, could you do me a small favor? Scroll down to the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It's like mission control here. We need to know your location and status before we continue. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, if the Americans and Soviets could race to the moon over sheer national pride, you can make the half-second sprint to click subscribe without burning up in the atmosphere. Up here, weightlessness hides the danger. Every panel inside the capsule is designed for function, not comfort. Buttons, dials, and switches are labeled in blocky Cyrillic. Some are worn from repeated use, others are pristine, because this machine hasn't been in space long enough to collect stories. On Earth, propaganda paints these moments as smooth and flawless. But the truth is different. The truth is made up of quiet, often boring technical details, voltage drops, oxygen flow rates, thermal control fluctuations, and it's these details unnoticed by the cheering crowds that decide whether this man will see Earth's surface again. You can picture it. Far below, night stretches over half the globe, dotted with the faint orange glow of cities and the occasional lightning storm flashing over the Pacific. The Soviet ground stations, scattered from Baikonur to Crimea, track his orbit with bulky antennas that creak as they move. Communication windows are short. When the capsule dips below the horizon, radio contact cuts out completely. That means, for long stretches of each 90-minute orbit, the cosmonaut is utterly alone. And in these silences, his mind drifts not just to his training, not just to his mission, but to the ordinary life waiting back home. This is the part of the story history books often glaze over, the human side. The weight of the suit pressing against your body, the faint smell of machine oil and heated electronics, the way your mouth dries out because the air inside is so carefully filtered it feels lifeless, and the knowledge that every sip of water, every breath you take, is part of a closed-loop system that could fail without warning. The glamour of space travel never mentions the metallic taste of fear. In 1962, the Soviet Union seemed untouchable in the race for space. They had put the first satellite in orbit with Sputnik, the first living creature with Laika, and the first human with Yuri Gagarin. Each success sent shockwaves through Washington, where American leaders quietly panicked over the technological and political gap. But what most of the world didn't see was how fragile each Soviet victory was. Behind the polished newsreels, every mission was a gamble, each success balanced on a mountain of rushed engineering, political pressure, and secrecy. Take this mission. The Vostok spacecraft, though revolutionary, was essentially a pressurized sphere attached to a service module packed with fuel, life support, and retro rockets. There was no way for the cosmonaut to steer it in orbit, only minor adjustments through attitude control thrusters. Re-entry was automatic. If something went wrong with the retrofire sequence, the pilot's fate depended entirely on backup timers and pre-programmed commands. And if those failed, the spacecraft could be stranded until its orbit decayed naturally, which might take days or weeks. Without power or proper orientation, that meant certain death. The Soviet program operated under a veil of military secrecy. Failures were hidden, accidents were denied or erased from the official record. This secrecy had a purpose. It maintained the image of unstoppable progress, but it also meant that inside the cramped control rooms, engineers and mission commanders worked with the weight of knowing they could not publicly admit to problems. Imagine sitting at a console, hearing the calm voice of a man in orbit reporting oxygen irregularities, and knowing that if you cannot fix it in the next 20 minutes, history will never speak his name. This tension was not just technical, it was deeply political. Every cosmonaut was a soldier in a propaganda war, and every launch was a statement to the world. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, understood the symbolic power of space. A man in orbit was not just a scientific achievement. It was proof that socialism could outpace capitalism in the most advanced fields of human endeavor. For the Americans, each Soviet success was a blow to national pride, one that could influence alliances, economic aid packages, and even military posture in far-off places like Southeast Asia. But up here, above the borders and ideologies, the propaganda fades into the background. The cosmonaut's world is reduced to the hiss of air circulation, the faint vibration of machinery, and the tiny movements of his gloved hands adjusting controls. He knows the mission's objectives. He's rehearsed them hundreds of times, but he also knows that space is indifferent to human politics. The laws of physics do not care about Moscow or Washington. As the capsule completes another orbit, he prepares for re-entry. This is the most dangerous part of the mission. The retro rockets must fire at precisely the right moment to slow the spacecraft enough to dip into the atmosphere. Fire too early, and you risk landing far from recovery forces, perhaps deep in hostile territory. Fire too late, and you might skip off the atmosphere like a stone on water, into a higher orbit you cannot escape. On the ground, engineers stare at rows of flickering indicator lights. In Baikonur, the tracking team calculates the spacecraft's trajectory on large mechanical plotters, tracing arcs across maps that stretch from the Soviet steppe to the forests of Siberia. Every minute matters. The capsule passes over Africa, then the Indian Ocean, moving silently across the face of the Earth at nearly 5 miles per second. At the retrofire moment, the capsule shudders. The rockets ignite, producing a deep, muffled vibration that travels through the cosmonaut's body. For a few tense seconds, nothing feels certain. Then, the engine cuts off. Silence again. The spacecraft begins to turn nose first, entering its descent path. Now, the real trial begins. As the heat shield faces forward, the thin upper atmosphere begins to press against the capsule. At first, it's a whisper, then a roar. The outer shell heats to thousands of degrees. Plasma envelopes the craft, cutting off radio contact. On the ground, the tracking stations lose the signal. Just as planned, but in the quiet between static, every person in mission control holds their breath. They know that somewhere up there, a human being is falling back to Earth, wrapped in a fireball, with no way to call for help if something goes wrong. Inside, the cosmonaut feels the G-forces mount. 3 times his body weight presses him into his seat. His vision narrows. Sweat stings his eyes. If the parachutes fail, he will impact at hundreds of miles per hour. If the capsule spins out of control, he will black out long before reaching the ground. And yet, he keeps his hands steady, watching the instruments with the same calm precision he was trained for. Somewhere in the final moments before parachute deployment, there is a shift, a sudden lightness, as the main canopy snaps open. The violent shaking turns into a gentle sway. Below, the Earth stretches out, green fields and dark forests. The capsule drifts toward the recovery zone, though perhaps not exactly where planned. In this era, cosmonauts eject from the capsule in the final stages of descent, parachuting separately to the ground. It is both a safety measure and a quirk of design. The Vostok capsule was never meant to land softly with its occupant inside. And then, just like that, the mission is over. On the ground, the first people to greet a returning cosmonaut are often local villagers, confused by the sight of a man in a silver suit stepping out of the sky. They offer bread, milk, and questions he cannot yet answer. Far away, in Moscow, the mission will be hailed as another triumph of Soviet science and engineering. The newspapers will print the hero's face. Speeches will be made. But none of them will mention the subtle failures, the close calls, or the small acts of human skill that made the difference between life and death. You might be wondering, how did the world get here? How did two nations, still recovering from the devastation of the Second World War, end up locked in a race to send men and machines into the cold void of space? What forces set the stage for this moment, and what quiet, often unseen details pushed it forward? That is where our story really begins. If you and I are going to understand how a man ended up alone in orbit, in a machine the size of a small garden shed, we need to go back to the ashes of the Second World War. Picture the spring of 1945. Europe is in ruins. Cities that once bustled with markets and music now stand in silence, their streets filled with rubble and twisted metal. The war is ending, but in that ending is the beginning of a new and very different kind of conflict. In the heart of Germany, in towns like Peenemünde and Nordhausen, the remains of the Nazi rocket program lie scattered across workshops, test ranges, and underground tunnels carved into mountainsides. These were not the work of amateurs. The Germans had built the V-2 rocket, short for Vergeltungswaffe 2, or Vengeance Weapon 2, a missile capable of travelling nearly 200 miles and striking London with a warhead from the edge of space. It was the first man-made object to reach what we now call the boundary of space. The V-2 was a weapon of terror, not exploration, but it was also a technological marvel for its time. As the war ground to its bloody conclusion, both the United States and the Soviet Union understood the significance of these rockets. Not because they saw space travel on the immediate horizon, but because rockets meant long-range weaponry. Whoever controlled this technology would control the future of warfare. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shown the destructive potential of nuclear weapons, but a nuclear warhead without a way to deliver it across continents was just a threat on paper. The V-2 design hinted at exactly that possibility. So, in the final days of the war, two races began at the same time. The first was for territory, as Soviet forces pushed westward and American forces pushed eastward, each side trying to seize as much of Germany as possible before the other did. The second was quieter, more secretive, a race for the people and the knowledge behind the rockets. Engineers, blueprints, test data, and even half-finished missile components were suddenly as valuable as gold. In the American-occupied zone, military intelligence teams carried out an operation later called Paperclip. Its aim was to identify and secure the best German scientists and bring them to the United States, regardless of their wartime affiliations. Some of these men had been members of the Nazi Party, and in the post-war moral haze, such details were quietly brushed aside if their skills were deemed too important to lose. Among them was Wernher von Braun, the charismatic and brilliant chief engineer behind the V-2 program. Von Braun and his team were moved to the United States, first to Fort Bliss in Texas and later to Huntsville, Alabama. There, they began work on adapting the V-2 design for American military use. They launched captured V-2s from White Sands, New Mexico, studying their performance and learning how to improve them. At this stage, space exploration was not the official goal. The focus was purely on building reliable rockets that could deliver warheads to distant targets. Meanwhile, in the east, Soviet forces moved quickly to secure their share of the spoils. They captured the V-2 assembly plant at Nordhausen and transported whatever they could back to the Soviet Union. Their program was led by Sergei Korolev, a man who would later be known as the chief designer and remain largely anonymous in the West for decades. Korolev's career was marked by both brilliance and tragedy before the war. He had been imprisoned during Stalin's purges, accused of sabotage in the Soviet aviation program. He survived the labor camps and was later released when his skills became too valuable to ignore. Korolev faced a difficult starting point. While the Americans had taken many of the leading German scientists intact, the Soviets had captured a great deal of hardware but fewer top-tier experts. Many of the Germans they did capture were kept under supervision for several years, forced to work on Soviet projects before being repatriated. From this uneven beginning, the Soviet program began reconstructing and improving the V-2 design, eventually leading to their own family of rockets. It is important to note here that both superpowers saw rocketry in the late 1940s as an extension of their military competition. Space was still an abstract idea. The immediate priority was missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, to be precise, that could carry nuclear warheads. The Cold War was already taking shape. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb, shocking American intelligence agencies that had expected them to be years behind. Suddenly, the prospect of a rocket capable of delivering such a weapon across the globe was not just theoretical. The Americans responded by accelerating their own missile programs, drawing heavily on von Braun's team's experience. And here's where the boring but significant details start to matter. Rocket technology was not just about power, it was about guidance systems, fuel mixtures, staging mechanisms, and structural integrity under extreme stress. A missile might be able to travel thousands of miles, but if it couldn't land within a few miles of its target, it was militarily useless. The V-2s had been impressive, but their accuracy was crude. Both nations poured resources into improving navigation, using gyroscopes, accelerometers, and early computer systems to refine their trajectories. In these years, the rivalry was still largely hidden from public view. You didn't see headlines about space races in 1950 or 1951. Instead, you saw quiet appropriations in defense budgets, classified contracts with engineering firms, and the expansion of test ranges. Out in the deserts of Kazakhstan and the American Southwest, rockets rose in secret, their launches witnessed only by soldiers, engineers, and the occasional rancher or shepherd who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. One of the most overlooked aspects of this period is how much of the work involved trial and error. Rockets exploded on launch pads, stages failed to separate, guidance systems drifted wildly off course. Each failure was a lesson, but each lesson was expensive in time, resources, and sometimes lives. In both countries, test crews worked under enormous pressure, knowing that a single public disaster could set back their program politically as well as technically. Korolev, working under the constant scrutiny of Soviet military officials, began pushing for larger, more powerful rockets that could serve both military and scientific purposes. This was a subtle but important shift. He understood that the same rocket capable of delivering a heavy nuclear warhead could also launch a satellite or a human being into orbit. In this dual-use logic lay the seed of the space race. On the American side, von Braun made similar arguments. In public, he occasionally spoke about the possibility of space travel, of manned missions to the Moon and Mars, but in official briefings, the language was always framed in terms of national security. The Cold War had created a climate where budgets were easier to secure if you could prove your project had military value. By the early 1950s, the foundations were in place. The technology had advanced enough that launching a small payload into orbit was now possible, at least in theory. But here is where politics began to accelerate the timeline. In the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had risen to power, eager to demonstrate the superiority of socialism through grand, undeniable achievements. In the United States, President Eisenhower was cautious, preferring slow, steady progress over flashy stunts. But he was also aware that public perception mattered. And so, the stage was set for a new kind of competition, one that would play out not just in secret laboratories and desert test ranges, but in full view of the entire world. What began as a race for missile supremacy was about to transform into a race for prestige, scientific achievement, and the hearts and minds of people across the globe. The question now was not whether either side could launch something into space. It was who would do it first, and how the world would respond when they did. It is the autumn of 1957. In the Soviet Union, the leaves are turning gold across the birch forests. and the air carries the sharp bite of the coming winter. But in Moscow, there is a warmth in the air, a quiet, confident sense that something extraordinary is about to happen. Out in the remote Kazakh steppe, at a place the world barely knows exists, the R-7 rocket stands on its launch pad. It is the most powerful missile ever built, the culmination of years of design, testing, and unpublicized failures. And it is about to change history. The R-7 had begun life as an intercontinental ballistic missile, designed to carry a nuclear warhead across oceans. Its size was astonishing, nearly 110 feet tall, with 4 strap-on boosters clustered around a central core. But its military usefulness was questionable. It took far too long to fuel, and its massive launch infrastructure made it vulnerable to attack. For many military planners, the R-7 was a cumbersome weapon. For Sergei Korolev, however, it was a gift. It had the raw power to place heavy objects into orbit, something no other rocket in the world could do at that moment. Korolev had been pushing for years to use the R-7 for a peaceful mission. His idea was simple but bold: launch the first artificial satellite into space. It would weigh just over 180 pounds, a polished sphere of aluminum alloy, barely the size of a beach ball, with 4 long antennae trailing behind it. Its sole function would be to transmit a steady beep-beep radio signal. There would be no cameras, no sensors, no scientific experiments. The beauty of the plan lay in its simplicity. The sound would be undeniable proof. The Soviet Union had reached space. In the United States, there were scientists who had been calling for such a mission for years. The International Geophysical Year, a global scientific initiative scheduled for 1957 to 1958, had provided a perfect excuse. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had announced plans to launch small satellites as part of the IGY. But in Washington, the program chosen to carry out this goal, Project Vanguard, was mired in delays, budget constraints, and political debates over whether to use military rockets for a civilian scientific mission. Korolev's approach was different. In the Soviet system, once the leadership approved a mission, there were few public debates to slow it down. There was, of course, immense political pressure to succeed, but there was also a willingness to push ahead with bold moves if they promised a propaganda victory. And in Khrushchev, Korolev had found a leader who understood the symbolic power of spaceflight. Khrushchev initially had little interest in space for its own sake, but when Korolev explained that a satellite circling the globe would show the world that Soviet rockets could reach anywhere on Earth, the idea clicked. The decision was made quietly. The satellite, code-named PS-1 for Prostyshi Sputnik, meaning simplest satellite, was rushed to completion. Engineers stripped away any features that might cause delays. No elaborate instruments, no complex systems, just a polished sphere, a battery, and a transmitter. On October 4th, 1957, as dusk settled over the steppe, the R-7's engines roared to life. The rocket rose in a slow, deliberate arc, shedding its boosters in flashes of light before disappearing into the darkening sky. Minutes later, the first beep-beep signals were heard at ground stations. For a moment, there was no celebration, only tense monitoring to make sure the satellite had achieved orbit. But once confirmation came, word spread quickly through the Soviet leadership. Khrushchev was delighted. Newspapers were prepared overnight. The next morning, headlines across the Soviet Union declared the triumph. The world's first artificial satellite was circling the Earth, and it was Soviet. In Washington, the news landed like a thunderclap. At first, many Americans assumed it was an exaggeration or propaganda, but the beep-beep was there, audible to anyone with the right kind of radio. Amateur operators across the globe tuned in, listening to the tiny, steady heartbeat of the satellite as it passed overhead every 96 minutes. It was a sound that carried more than just data. It carried the weight of a shifting world order. The public reaction in the United States was a mix of awe, curiosity, and anxiety. Newspapers printed diagrams showing Sputnik's orbit. Schools organized outdoor gatherings so students could watch it pass in the night sky, a faint moving point of light. But the military and political leadership were deeply concerned. If the Soviet Union could launch a satellite into orbit, they reasoned, it could also launch a nuclear warhead to any point on the globe. The psychological effect was as important as the technical achievement. The Eisenhower administration tried to project calm. Officially, they praised the Soviet achievement as a contribution to science. Privately, they understood the strategic implications and began accelerating American space and missile programs. But events soon compounded the pressure. Less than a month later, on November 3rd, the Soviets launched a second satellite, Sputnik 2, this one carrying a living passenger, a small Moscow street dog named Laika. She became the first living creature to orbit the Earth. Laika's mission was a public relations coup, but also a grim reminder of the risks of early spaceflight. The technology for safe re-entry did not yet exist for such missions, and it was understood from the outset that Laika would not survive. The Soviet press presented her as a heroine, a symbol of courage in the service of human progress. In the West, the mission sparked debates over animal welfare, but also reinforced the image of Soviet technological superiority. For Korolev and his team, the early Sputnik missions were a validation of years of work under immense pressure. Yet even in success, the challenges were enormous. The R-7 was not a practical weapon. It could not be kept fueled and ready for immediate launch. It was, however, the only rocket in the world capable of putting such payloads into orbit. The Americans had smaller rockets that could potentially reach space, but none with the reliability or lifting capacity of the Soviet booster. In the United States, the initial plan to launch the first satellite with the Vanguard rocket continued, but on December 6, 1957, the much-anticipated launch ended in public humiliation. The rocket rose just a few feet off the pad before collapsing back down in a fiery explosion, captured on live television. For the American public, the contrast with the Soviet successes could not have been starker. For the Soviet Union, it was an opportunity to quietly enjoy the disarray of its rival without saying too much that might invite retaliation. And yet, behind the scenes, both nations were learning from each other's successes and failures. In Washington, there was a growing recognition that the United States could no longer treat space purely as a scientific sideshow. The creation of NASA in 1958, merging various existing programs under one civilian agency, was a direct response to the Sputnik shock. In Moscow, there was a renewed push to capitalize on the momentum, with plans already forming for the next great leap, putting a human being into orbit. The early Soviet momentum was built not just on technical skill, but on the ability to act quickly, to focus resources on a clear and immediate goal. The Americans were catching up, but for now, the image of Soviet rockets arching into the sky was etched deeply into the global imagination. And in this race, image mattered almost as much as capability, which leaves us with a question worth holding on to. In a competition where every move is broadcast to the world, is it better to risk failure in public or to keep your setbacks hidden in the shadows until you are certain of success? In the winter of 1957, Washington was not a place known for panic. The corridors of power had weathered wars, depressions, and political crises. But in the weeks after the first beep-beep from orbit, there was a subtle, restless energy in the air. You could feel it in the way senators asked sharper questions in committee hearings, in the clipped language of military briefings, and in the sudden flood of newspaper editorials calling for action. The United States had been beaten not in a battle, but in a race for prestige that touched something deeper than most Americans had realized. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man known for his calm under pressure, refused to match the Soviets' triumph with public dramatics. To him, the situation called for steady, methodical work, not rash gestures. He understood that the ability to launch a satellite was not the same as the ability to deliver a nuclear warhead with precision. And in private, His military advisors reassured him that the United States still held significant advantages in its bomber fleet and nuclear stockpile. But Eisenhower also knew that perception could quickly shape reality. If America looked like it was falling behind, allies might lose confidence, and adversaries might grow bolder. The official American satellite program for the International Geophysical Year was still Project Vanguard, managed by the Naval Research Laboratory. Vanguard was chosen partly for political reasons. It was a civilian project, which would make it easier to claim that America's space program was peaceful and separate from its military missile programs. But the Vanguard rocket was new, untested, and less powerful than some military alternatives. Wernher von Braun and his team in the Army Ballistic Missile Agency had been quietly arguing for years that they could put a satellite into orbit much sooner using a modified Redstone missile. Their proposals had been rejected in favor of the more politically palatable Vanguard. Then came December 6th, 1957. The launch site at Cape Canaveral was prepared for a televised triumph. Vanguard's small satellite, barely the size of a grapefruit, sat atop the three-stage rocket, waiting for its moment. Cameras rolled, reporters stood by, and millions of Americans tuned in. For 2 seconds, the rocket lifted gracefully from the pad, flames billowing beneath it. Then it shuddered, lost thrust, and fell back in a slow, humiliating collapse. The explosion was not massive, but the damage to national pride was. Within hours, foreign newspapers ran headlines mocking the failure. Some called it Flopnik, others Kaputnik. The disaster changed the political calculus. Eisenhower, still reluctant to engage in a public race, nevertheless authorized von Braun's team to attempt a satellite launch using their Jupiter C rocket. The engineers worked with intense focus, modifying the missile to carry a scientific payload. On January 31st, 1958, Explorer 1 rose from Cape Canaveral, its slender white frame climbing smoothly into the night sky. This time, there was no failure. Hours later, confirmation came that the United States had its first satellite in orbit. Explorer 1 carried instruments designed by Dr. James Van Allen of the University of Iowa. These detected unexpected levels of radiation in space, leading to the discovery of the Van Allen radiation belts, an important scientific breakthrough. The launch restored some measure of American confidence, but the gap in perception remained. The Soviets had been first, and they had done it with apparent ease. The months after Sputnik saw a flurry of activity in Washington. Congressional hearings examined the state of American science education and research funding. The National Defense Education Act was passed, pumping money into schools, universities, and technical training. The idea was not just to catch up in rockets, but to build a generation of scientists and engineers who could compete with Soviet counterparts. In July 1958, Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, creating NASA from a patchwork of existing research organizations, including the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA. NASA would be a civilian agency, but it would work closely with the military, drawing on their experience and hardware. Its mission was broad: explore space for peaceful purposes, conduct scientific research, and develop the technology necessary for human spaceflight. Even before NASA was officially operational, plans were underway for a manned space program. The military services each had their own ideas, but the program that emerged was called Project Mercury. Its goal was simple in words, but daunting in execution: put a human into orbit and return them safely. To choose the astronauts, NASA announced a search for candidates with specific qualifications. They had to be military test pilots, under 40 years old, shorter than 5 feet 11 inches to fit into the capsule, and in excellent physical condition. In April 1959, NASA introduced the Mercury 7 to the public. Their names, Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, Gordon Cooper, and Deke Slayton, would soon be known across the nation. These men were not scientists, but they were accustomed to high-risk situations, split-second decisions, and the grueling demands of experimental flight. The Mercury capsule they would fly was tiny, barely large enough for one person to sit inside, packed with controls, gauges, and life support systems. It was designed for simplicity and reliability. No room to walk, stretch, or do much beyond monitoring systems and responding to emergencies. Von Braun's team continued to refine the rockets that would carry the Mercury capsules. Initially, suborbital flights using the Redstone missile would test the systems and procedures. Full orbital flights would require the more powerful Atlas rocket, a missile still in development and known for its tendency to explode during testing. Each launch would be a gamble, and each failure would be visible to the world. The tension in these years was not just technological, it was psychological. American leaders knew that the Soviets were working toward putting a human in orbit, and that being second in this milestone would reinforce the perception of inferiority. But rushing into a manned flight carried risks not only for the astronauts, but for the program's credibility. A fatal accident in front of the cameras could be more damaging than another delay. Meanwhile, the Soviet program, still cloaked in secrecy, moved steadily toward its own manned flight. In the absence of official information, rumors and speculation filled the gap in the West. Some claimed the Soviets had already lost cosmonauts in secret missions. Whether true or not, such stories only added to the aura of mystery and capability surrounding the Soviet space effort. For the United States, the path forward after the Vanguard disaster was clear. Rebuild public trust, prove reliability, and demonstrate that American technology could match or surpass Soviet achievements. Explorer 1 had been a first step, but it was the human flights of Project Mercury that would be the real test. And yet, even as NASA prepared for these missions, the question remained, could careful, methodical engineering close a gap that had been opened by bold, decisive moves? Or was the United States destined to follow the Soviet lead, always arriving just a step too late? On the morning of April 12, 1961, the launch pad at the Baikonur Cosmodrome was shrouded in the pale light of dawn. A raw wind swept across the steppe, carrying with it the smell of fuel and the low rumble of machinery. In the shadow of the towering R-7 rocket stood a young man in an orange flight suit, his helmet under one arm, smiling with an ease that belied the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. His name was Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin, and within hours, he would be the first human to leave the Earth. The decision to launch a man into space had not been taken lightly by the Soviet leadership. Chief designer Sergei Korolev, whose name was still a state secret, had been pressing for a manned mission ever since the success of Sputnik 1. His reasoning was simple. If the Soviet Union could be the first to put a human in orbit, it would be a triumph unmatched in the annals of exploration and a propaganda victory of staggering proportions. But the risks were immense. Rockets were still temperamental machines, prone to catastrophic failure. Life support systems had never been tested in orbit with a human occupant, and the political stakes were higher than ever. Gagarin was one of 20 candidates chosen from the Soviet Air Force, all young, fit, and experienced pilots. From these, a smaller group of 6 was trained intensively in survival skills, orbital mechanics, spacecraft systems, and physical endurance. The final decision came down to 2 men, Gagarin and German Titov. Gagarin's natural charm, composure under stress, and ability to inspire confidence tipped the scales in his favor. The spacecraft he would ride was called Vostok 1. It was a spherical capsule, just over 2 meters in diameter, with no ability for the pilot to control its orientation or trajectory. Everything was automated, though a manual override code was sealed in an envelope in case of emergency. The mission plan was simple but daring. Launch into orbit, complete a single circuit of the Earth, and re-enter over Soviet territory. At 7 a.m., Moscow time, the massive R-7's engines roared to life, lifting Vostok 1 from the pad in a column of fire and smoke. As the rocket climbed through the atmosphere, Gagarin's calm voice came over the radio. Poyakali, let's go. The phrase would become legendary, a symbol of humanity's first leap into the cosmos. The ascent was smooth, though Gagarin's heart rate reached 150 beats per minute during the launch. Within minutes, the booster stages had separated, and he was in orbit, looking down at a blue and white planet bathed in sunlight. He described the view as beautiful. The Earth is so small, so blue. For 1 hour and 48 minutes, he circled the globe, passing over continents and oceans that he could identify only by their shapes and colors. In the West, the news came as a shock. The Soviet announcement was swift and triumphant, accompanied by Gagarin's smiling portrait. The United States, still months away from its first manned orbital flight, was once again in second place. Newspapers ran headlines in bold type, some celebrating the achievement as a milestone for all humankind, others framing it as a challenge America had to meet. But the mission was not without its dangers. As Vostok 1 re-entered the atmosphere, the service module failed to separate cleanly, causing the spacecraft to spin wildly before the heat and aerodynamic forces tore the two sections apart. Gagarin endured intense G-forces before the capsule stabilized. At about 7 kilometers above the ground, he ejected from the capsule, parachuting down to a field near the Volga River. Local farmers and a young girl watched in amazement as the man in an orange suit landed and waved to them, explaining that he was a Soviet citizen who had just come from space. In Moscow, Gagarin was welcomed as a hero. He toured the world, shaking hands with presidents and prime ministers, his boyish grin and unpretentious manner winning admiration far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. In the propaganda battle, the effect was electric. The Soviets had not only demonstrated technological prowess, they had put a human face to it, one that radiated confidence and optimism. For Sergei Korolev, the victory was deeply personal. He had spent years laboring under conditions of secrecy and political pressure, his own identity hidden even from many of his colleagues. The success of Vostok 1 vindicated his vision, but it also set the bar higher. The Kremlin wanted more longer flights, more ambitious missions, perhaps even a landing on the moon. In Washington, the mood was a mixture of admiration and alarm. President John F. Kennedy, only 3 months into his term, understood the symbolic power of Gagarin's flight. At a meeting with his advisors, he asked bluntly, "Is there any space program which promises dramatic results in which we could win?" NASA's Mercury program was making progress, but the Atlas rocket still had a checkered reliability record. Alan Shepard was scheduled to make a suborbital flight in May, but that would be a short, up-and-down hop, not an orbital mission like Gagarin's. The challenge was now clear. The United States could no longer afford to let the Soviets claim every first in space. But the path forward would require bold political commitment, vast financial resources, and an acceptance of the risks involved in pushing technology to its limits. Back in the Soviet Union, the public saw only the smiling Gagarin and the gleaming spacecraft. They did not hear about the technical mishaps, the close calls, or the fact that the cosmonaut had landed separately from his capsule, a detail kept secret to avoid disqualifying the flight under certain international aviation rules. The Vostok program would continue, sending more cosmonauts on increasingly ambitious missions, but each would carry the same weight of political expectation. For Gagarin himself, the journey had been the fulfillment of a dream, but also the start of a new life he had not entirely chosen. The state controlled his appearances, his movements, even his flying. Though he longed to return to active duty as a pilot, he was deemed too valuable as a symbol to risk in dangerous assignments. His face became a fixture on posters, coins, and stamps, his name synonymous with the dawn of the space age. The April morning when Yuri Gagarin called out, "Let's go," had altered the course of history. It had shown that human beings could survive and work in space, and it had placed the Soviet Union firmly in the lead in the most visible technological race of the 20th century. But it had also raised the stakes for both sides. The race was no longer about satellites or probes, it was about people, prestige, and the future of exploration beyond Earth. The spring of 1961 had been a bruising season for the United States. In the span of just a few months, the Soviet Union had put the first human into orbit. Fidel Castro's Cuba had humiliated the CIA at the Bay of Pigs, and the sense of American technological and strategic superiority, so unquestioned only a few years earlier, was visibly shaken. President John F. Kennedy, still in the first months of his administration, understood the power of perception. Politics, he knew, was as much about what people believed as about the raw facts. The Soviet triumph with Yuri Gagarin's flight was not just a technical milestone, it was a potent global symbol. Wherever Kennedy's diplomats went, they heard variations of the same question. Was America falling behind? In the days following Gagarin's orbit on April 12th, Kennedy convened his science and defense advisors. The president wanted to know if there was a space goal, any space goal where the United States could beat the Soviets. He asked, almost bluntly, "Is there any space program which promises dramatic results in which we could win?" NASA Administrator James Webb and Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who chaired the National Space Council, brought the question to the experts. The answer that came back was sobering. In low Earth orbit, the Soviets had a head start that would be hard to erase in the short term. They had more powerful boosters, more flight experience, and a demonstrated ability to send a man around the Earth. But there was one frontier, one audacious target, where the United States could, if it committed now, reach before the Soviets: the Moon. The idea was not new. Engineers and visionaries had been talking about lunar missions for years, and Wernher von Braun had sketched preliminary plans for lunar spacecraft as early as the 1950s. But until that moment, a crude moon landing had seemed like a distant dream, the stuff of science fiction and speculative engineering. Now, in the context of the Cold War, it became a geopolitical weapon. A moon landing would not be a single spectacular event, but the culmination of years of increasingly ambitious steps, each one a demonstration of American ingenuity and power. The Soviets might dominate the early game, but America could win the endgame. Kennedy was cautious by instinct. The moon program would be staggeringly expensive. Estimates ranged from $20 billion to over $40 billion more than the entire Apollo program eventually cost, and a sum equal to several percent of the federal budget. The risks were enormous. Astronauts could die, rockets could explode on live television, and the prestige blow of a failure might be worse than doing nothing. Yet the alternative ceding leadership in the most visible technological contest in human history was unthinkable. Kennedy understood that the space race was not merely about science or exploration. It was about the future of influence, alliances, and ideology. On May 5th, 1961, the US finally had its own manned spaceflight success. Alan Shepard aboard Freedom 7 made a 15-minute suborbital flight, launched by a Mercury Redstone rocket. It was a shorter, less technically complex mission than Gagarin's orbit, but it was still a victory of sorts, a proof that America could put a man in space and bring him back alive. Shepard's flight gave Kennedy the breathing room he needed to make his case. In the weeks that followed, Kennedy worked behind the scenes to build consensus. He pressed Congress for support, met with NASA leadership, and spoke with military and industrial figures who would play key roles in the program. Lyndon Johnson, whose political skills in Congress were unmatched, became the chief negotiator for resources and backing. Finally, on May 25th, Kennedy went before a joint session of Congress. In a speech that would become one of the most famous of his presidency, he framed the challenge in stark, visionary terms. "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." The chamber was hushed. Kennedy acknowledged the costs, the risks, and the magnitude of the effort. but he insisted that the goal was within America's grasp if the nation acted decisively. He linked the moonshot to the broader struggle for freedom, casting it as a demonstration of the values and capabilities that defined the United States. The speech electrified NASA. For years, the agency had been building capabilities in small steps, launching satellites, testing rockets, and sending chimpanzees into space. Now they had a clear, dramatic objective, one that justified bold leaps in engineering. The moon goal would require mastering orbital rendezvous, developing heavy-lift boosters far beyond anything in service, creating spacecraft capable of sustaining life for days, and designing re-entry systems that could survive return from lunar velocity. For Wernher von Braun, Kennedy's commitment was a dream come true. Von Braun had been lobbying for a large booster program for years, convinced that only a rocket like the proposed Saturn series could open the way to true exploration. Now he had the political mandate and the funding to build it. The decision also reshaped America's industrial landscape. Billions of dollars flowed into aerospace companies, research universities, and subcontractors. Entire new facilities sprang up. The Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, the Saturn rocket assembly sites, new launch complexes at Cape Canaveral. Engineers, technicians, and scientists were recruited in unprecedented numbers. By the mid-1960s, the Apollo program would employ hundreds of thousands of people directly and indirectly. In the Soviet Union, the announcement was received with a mix of skepticism and concern. Sergei Korolev's team had its own lunar ambitions, but resources were limited, and political priorities often shifted. The Kremlin had not yet committed to a crewed moon landing. Their focus remained on short-term propaganda victories, long-duration flights, multiple cosmonauts, and perhaps a spacewalk. But Kennedy's bold public target forced them to consider a long-term race on terms set by the Americans. For the American public, Kennedy's challenge was both inspiring and daunting. Many were thrilled by the idea of sending astronauts to another world, but others questioned whether the expense was justified, especially with domestic needs competing for federal dollars. Civil rights leaders, in particular, sometimes pointed to the contrast between the billions spent on space and the poverty still evident in parts of the country. Kennedy himself was not blind to these tensions. In private, he sometimes expressed doubts about whether the space race was the best use of national resources. But once the commitment was made, he understood the necessity of seeing it through. Backing down would be politically disastrous and strategically damaging. In the months that followed his speech, NASA accelerated its work on the Mercury and Gemini programs, the stepping stones to Apollo. Mercury would prove America's ability to send men into space and return them safely. Gemini would develop the skills needed for the moon mission, including spacewalking, orbital rendezvous, and long-duration flight. The Saturn rocket program began in earnest, with Saturn I test flights in the early 1960s and the more powerful Saturn V on the drawing board. The lunar spacecraft eventually split into the command module, and lunar module entered design and testing. Every component would need to be invented, built, and proven in just a few years. Kennedy's moon speech was more than a call to action. It was a deliberate gamble on America's ability to mobilize talent, technology, and willpower. In the high-stakes environment of the Cold War, it reframed the space race from a reactive struggle into a proactive quest for a definitive, history-making victory. By the end of 1961, the outlines of Apollo were visible, though the path ahead was still uncertain. Rockets would fail, astronauts would face dangers no one had yet encountered. The Soviets were still formidable competitors, but for the first time since Sputnik, the United States had seized the initiative. The finish line was clear, the dusty, cratered surface of the moon. July 20, 1969. It is easy in retrospect to see this day as inevitable. The footage is so iconic, so worn into our collective memory, that it feels like it was always destined to happen. But for the men inside the lunar module Eagle, there is nothing inevitable about it, only a string of decisions, calculations, and risks, each of which could send them hurtling into a silent crater or stranded in an orbit they would never leave. Neil Armstrong sits in the left seat, Buzz Aldrin in the right. Michael Collins, their crewmate in the command module Columbia, watches from orbit, tasked with keeping the home ship running. He will be the one to take them home if they can get back off the moon's surface. The Eagle begins its descent from lunar orbit. This is the moment every simulation, every whiteboard sketch, every wind tunnel test has led toward. The moon does not have an atmosphere thick enough to slow their fall with parachutes or aerodynamic drag. There is only the descent engine, a single gimbal-mounted rocket bell that has to fire perfectly for 13 straight minutes. If it quits early, they will smash into the surface. If it overthrusts or burns too long, they will run out of fuel trying to hover or correct their trajectory. Inside Mission Control in Houston, the tension is palpable. Gene Kranz, the flight director, sits with his white vest and narrowed eyes, headset pressed to one ear. Around him, rows of engineers and controllers murmur over their consoles, reading streams of numbers. It is quiet, too quiet for what is actually happening 240 miles away. Almost immediately, problems begin to creep in. The computer starts throwing out program alarms 1,202, then 1,201. These are not just error messages. They're signs that the onboard computer is overloading, unable to keep up with the flood of radar data and control inputs. Guidance Officer Steve Bales, all of 26 years old, has seconds to decide whether to call for an abort. He glances at his backroom support team, who tell him it's safe to continue if the alarms clear quickly. Bales gives the word, go. But then Armstrong looks out the window. The spot their trajectory is taking them toward is no smooth plain. It's a field of boulders, boulders the size of cars. In an instant, he takes manual control. Fuel begins to bleed away faster than planned. The descent profile is now irregular, pulling them off the tightly choreographed timeline. In Houston, the fuel readings are the only story anyone cares about. 60 seconds. The voice from the backroom counts down not just time, but the last drops of propellant they have before the descent engine shuts off automatically. Armstrong keeps scanning for a safe place to land. Dust begins to swirl outside the window from the rocket exhaust, a cloud that obscures the view and makes it impossible to tell how high they are. 30 seconds. In the viewing gallery above Mission Control, NASA Administrator Thomas Paine grips the railing so hard his knuckles blanch. On the other side of the glass, reporters watch with headphones pressed tight, scribbling notes they hope won't be obituaries. Finally, with only a handful of seconds left, Armstrong eases the throttle and the Eagle settles onto the lunar surface. The call comes, contact light. A pause then. Engine stop. Armstrong keys his mic. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. The relief in Charlie Duke's voice as he replies, Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Is genuine. In Houston, people hug, cry, and slam each other on the back. But for Armstrong and Aldrin, the mission is only halfway done. They still have to get home. Outside the Eagle, the moon is silent and alien. Every step Armstrong takes will be photographed, filmed, and studied for decades. His words, deliberate, understated, will be played endlessly, though no one will hear the heart rate monitor beeping steadily in the background. Aldrin will call the view magnificent desolation, a phrase as poetic as anything spoken from space. They plant the American flag not as a claim of ownership, but as a marker of achievement. They collect samples, deploy experiments, and take photographs. And when the time comes, they climb back into the Eagle, sealing themselves once again in the tiny cabin. They know that the ascent engine beneath them has never been fired in this configuration before. If it doesn't light, they will die on the moon. It does. They meet Collins in lunar orbit, dock, and begin the long journey home. 4 days later, the Columbia splashes down in the Pacific, and the space race, at least in its most symbolic sense, is over. The United States has won. But winning does not mean the race ends. It only changes the course. The night of July 24, 1969, the Apollo 11 crew splashed down in the Pacific Ocean to a hero's welcome. They were quarantined for 3 weeks. NASA's insurance against moon germs, but even from inside a sealed trailer, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were feted as global celebrities. Presidents called. Parades were planned. The world had just witnessed the most expensive, most technically complex, and arguably most daring peacetime achievement in human history. And yet, behind the cheering crowds, there was an unease NASA could already feel in its bones. The United States had set a single clear goal in 1961: beat the Soviets to the moon. That had now been done. The public, for all its patriotic fervor, had been watching the Apollo program not out of deep scientific curiosity, but because it was a race. And as with any race, once the finish line was crossed, the question became, why keep running? A nation's attention wanders. In 1969, the US was still mired in the Vietnam War. Civil rights protests continued across the country. Inflation was creeping upward. The environmental movement was gaining steam, demanding attention and resources. Against that backdrop, the idea of spending billions more to send astronauts back to the moon, and possibly to Mars, was a harder sell than it had been when the Soviets were still beating America at every turn. Polls taken in late 1969 were revealing. A majority of Americans supported the Apollo program, but fewer than half thought the expense could still be justified. Television ratings for Apollo 12, just 4 months after Armstrong's first step, dropped sharply. By Apollo 13, public interest had dropped so low that the networks didn't even broadcast the crew's pre-disaster transmissions live. Even within NASA, some worried the program had become a victim of its own success. Dr. Robert Gilruth, director of the Manned Spacecraft Center, later admitted, "We'd been so focused on winning that we didn't think enough about what would come after, the Soviets' shift strategy." On the other side of the world, the Soviet Union was confronting its own lunar hangover, but for different reasons. The Nun rocket, their would-be answer to America's Saturn V, had failed in all 4 test launches, each ending in catastrophic explosions. In 1974, the program was quietly cancelled. Publicly, the Soviets downplayed the lunar race entirely, reframing their space program as being more about long-term presence in orbit. Why visit the moon for a few days when you can live in space for months became the new talking point. The Salyut space stations, and later Mir, were the embodiment of this pivot, a strategy that would allow the USSR to claim leadership in sustained human spaceflight, even as the Americans kept sending astronauts to the moon. The budget axe falls. NASA's budget, which had peaked in 1966 at 4.4% of federal spending, began to fall almost immediately after Apollo 11. President Richard Nixon, while willing to celebrate the moon landing, had little political incentive to keep funding a program launched by his predecessor. His administration quietly scaled back future missions, cancelling Apollo 18, 19, and 20. For NASA's engineers, this was a blow not just to pride, but to momentum. The Saturn V production line was shut down. Plans for a permanent lunar base were shelved. Proposals for a manned Mars mission in the 1980s were reduced to glossy concept art in public relations pamphlets. Wernher von Braun, the architect of the Saturn V, was reassigned within NASA, his vision of deep space exploration indefinitely deferred. He would later leave the agency entirely, taking a position at Fairchild Industries. Science versus spectacle. In the absence of the race, NASA leaned harder into the scientific case for continuing Apollo. Each mission after Apollo 11 carried more sophisticated experiments and stayed on the lunar surface for longer periods. Apollo 15, 16, and 17 brought along the lunar roving vehicle, allowing astronauts to explore miles from the landing site. Geologists would later call the Apollo sample collection the most significant leap in planetary science in history. But science, no matter how groundbreaking, lacked the visceral pull of a geopolitical duel. The photographs of astronauts collecting rocks simply didn't grab headlines the way a tense countdown against the Soviets once had. The moon was no longer a mysterious, unreachable world it had been visited, walked on, and, in a sense, tamed. A program winds down. By December 1972, Apollo 17 marked the last time humans stood on the moon. Gene Cernan, the mission commander, closed out his final transmission with the words, "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." It was both a promise and a question mark. No one at NASA imagined it would take more than 50 years for that return to happen. In the years that followed, the enormous infrastructure built for Apollo was dismantled or repurposed. Launch Complex 39A at Cape Kennedy, once the stage for history's mightiest rockets, would stand silent for years at a time. The sprawling vehicle assembly building, which had housed the Saturn V, became an empty cathedral of steel and concrete between shuttle launches. What? The race left behind. The space race had transformed human capability. It had driven advances in computing, materials science, telecommunications, and navigation. It had inspired a generation of engineers, scientists, and dreamers. But with the geopolitical driver removed, the question of what next became harder to answer. For the United States, the end of the race ushered in a new era of spaceflight, one defined less by flags and footprints and more by reusable spacecraft, orbital laboratories, and, eventually, international cooperation. For the Soviet Union, it meant focusing on where they could still claim dominance. Long-duration missions and space station technology. The moon faded from the front pages, but the legacy of that frantic decade of competition would echo for decades to come. The end of Apollo was not the end of space exploration, but it was the end of the grand, headline-grabbing leaps that had defined the space race. The 1970s ushered in a different chapter, one shaped by pragmatism, politics, and the slow grind of technology development. It was the era of the space shuttle, a program born from a desire to bring down costs and make spaceflight routine, but also one deeply intertwined with Cold War tensions that had not disappeared with the moon landing. NASA's vision was revolutionary, a reusable spacecraft that could ferry astronauts and cargo to low Earth, orbit and back, over and over again. The shuttle promised to be a vehicle that transformed space from an expensive, rare event into a frequent, reliable part of American life and defense. But achieving that vision would prove more difficult than anyone imagined. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was also building its own next-generation spacecraft, the Buran, which closely resembled the shuttle but carried its own unique innovations. The Soviet space program, now focused on long-duration missions aboard their Salyut and later Mir space stations, saw the shuttle not only as a rival, but as a threat, a new phase in the technological competition that would unfold in the shadow of the Cold War. The excitement that once surrounded human spaceflight had changed by the early 1970s. The explosive thrill of rockets blasting off toward the moon had given way to a quieter, more practical pursuit: how to make space travel routine, reliable, and sustainable. The Apollo missions had demonstrated that humans could leave Earth's gravity and return safely, but they had also exposed the staggering cost and complexity involved. The question now was not only, can we go to space, but how can we stay there and make it useful? Enter the Space Shuttle program, NASA's ambitious answer to this challenge. The shuttle was conceived as a reusable spacecraft, a vehicle that could launch like a rocket and land like a plane, capable of ferrying crews and equipment into orbit repeatedly. The promise was profound: lower costs, increased frequency of flights, and expanded scientific and military capabilities. For a nation still locked in Cold War rivalry, the shuttle was not just a tool of exploration, but a symbol of technological supremacy. Yet this promise came with hidden challenges. The shuttle was unlike any spacecraft before it. It needed to withstand the brutal heat of re-entry repeatedly, carry heavy payloads, and land precisely on a runway. Designing and building such a system pushed engineers to the very limits of materials, science, aerodynamics, and systems engineering. The program's costs ballooned far beyond initial estimates, and the timeline stretched from the early 1970s well into the early 1980s before the first flight. On the Soviet side, the story was both parallel and divergent. The USSR's answer to the shuttle was the Buran, a winged orbiter remarkably similar in appearance to NASA's design but developed independently and featuring several distinct technological advances, including the ability to fly unmanned. The Soviet space program, though shadowed by economic constraints and political shifts, was determined not to lose ground in the space competition, even if the goalposts had shifted from planting flags to maintaining continuous presence in orbit. The story of the shuttle era is one of contrasts between ambition and budget realities, between innovation and risk, and between cooperation and competition. NASA's decision to pursue the shuttle program was driven partly by necessity. The Apollo program, despite its dramatic successes, was too expensive to maintain indefinitely. Funding cuts began to bite as the American public's attention turned elsewhere, to the wars, social movements, and economic struggles of the 1970s. Politicians demanded a program that would demonstrate practical benefits: satellite deployment, scientific experiments, military reconnaissance, and do so without consuming vast amounts of taxpayer money. The shuttle promised to meet those demands. Unlike Apollo's single-use Saturn rockets, the shuttle's partially reusable design was expected to reduce launch costs dramatically. It could carry up to 50 pounds of cargo, including satellites, space telescopes, and components for space stations. It could deliver and retrieve payloads, repair satellites in orbit, and serve as a platform for science. These capabilities were attractive not just to NASA, but to the Department of Defense and commercial satellite operators. However, the shuttle's technical complexity was staggering. Its main engines needed to restart in space. The thermal protection system required thousands of heat-resistant tiles, each hand-fitted and fragile. The solid rocket boosters, necessary to provide lift-off thrust, were powerful but could not be throttled or shut down once ignited. Every flight was a ballet of timing, precision, and trust in engineering. In the Soviet Union, the stakes were equally high. While NASA wrestled with the shuttle's development, the USSR had focused its human spaceflight efforts on orbital stations. The Salyut program, beginning in the early 1970s, pioneered long-duration missions, allowing cosmonauts to spend months in orbit, conducting experiments, testing life support systems, and studying the effects of microgravity. These achievements were touted domestically as evidence of Soviet endurance and technical mastery. The Buran Orbiter project, which began in the late 1970s, was intended to match or surpass the shuttle's capabilities. Unlike NASA's crewed-only approach, Buran was designed to operate autonomously, capable of completing unmanned missions, an advantage if political or technical issues prevented a cosmonaut from flying. Its first and only flight in November 1988 was unmanned and fully automated, a remarkable technical feat that demonstrated Soviet innovation. The orbiter completed 2 orbits of Earth and returned to a perfect landing, but the program was cancelled soon after due to economic turmoil and shifting priorities. The parallel development of these 2 spaceplane systems underlined a new phase of the space race, one focused less on dramatic firsts and more on sustainable, versatile access to low Earth orbit. Yet, even as the space shuttle was poised to change the nature of human spaceflight, the Cold War continued to cast a long shadow over activities in orbit. The shuttle was envisioned as a vehicle capable of military applications, including the deployment and repair of reconnaissance satellites, and potentially even anti-satellite weapons. Its flexibility and reusability made it a powerful strategic asset. The United States Air Force participated actively in shuttle planning, eager to leverage the vehicle for national security purposes. However, this raised questions about the militarization of space and sparked debate both inside and outside government circles. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 forbade the placement of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit, but it left much ambiguity about what other military uses were permissible. For the Soviets, the shuttle's capabilities were a challenge. They feared the strategic advantages it could confer on the United States and redoubled their efforts in space station technology, orbital reconnaissance, and anti-satellite weaponry. The Cold War competition that had once been played out in booms and bursts on Earth now played out as a quiet duel hundreds of miles above. NASA's first shuttle flight, STS-1, lifted off on April 12, 1981, the 20th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's pioneering orbit. The orbiter Columbia soared into the sky, marking a milestone in spaceflight history. The two-man crew, John Young and Robert Crippen, faced unknowns at every stage. This was a completely new kind of vehicle, with unprecedented systems and operational challenges. The flight went remarkably well, despite several close calls, and ushered in a new era where the shuttle became the workhorse of NASA. Over the next 3 decades, the shuttle fleet flew 135 missions, deploying satellites, servicing the Hubble Space Telescope, and ferrying crews and components to space stations. Its cargo bay became a workshop and garage in orbit. Yet the shuttle was not without tragedy. The Challenger disaster in 1986 and the Columbia disaster in 2003 served as grim reminders that even routine spaceflight remained perilous. In both cases, flaws in design, management, and decision-making cost the lives of astronauts and grounded the program for years. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued their space station efforts. The Mir space station, launched in 1986, became the world's first modular space station, hosting crews for record-breaking durations and fostering international cooperation with visitors from Europe, Japan, and later the United States. Despite economic hardships and political upheaval, Mir symbolized Soviet and later Russian commitment to a permanent human presence in orbit. By the end of the 1980s, the space race was transforming. The rivalry of the Cold War began to thaw as détente gave way to cooperation. The shuttle program's flexibility helped facilitate joint missions, including the Shuttle Mir program in the 1990s. The Americans and Russians found themselves no longer competitors, racing to beat each other to the next frontier, but partners building a shared future in space. The shuttle era and the renewed Soviet space station efforts reflect a larger truth about the space race. It was never just about rockets and astronauts. It was about technology and geopolitics, yes, but also about human endurance, ambition, and the desire to reach beyond what seemed possible. It was about how two rival nations, locked in ideological conflict, pushed the boundaries of science and engineering to astonishing heights. Even as the 20th century closed, the story of spaceflight was far from over. The shuttle would retire in the early 2010s, succeeded by new programs aimed at returning to the Moon and eventually Mars. Russia would continue to operate space stations, merging Mir's legacy into the International Space Station. And new players from Europe, China, India, and private companies would join the cosmos's crowded field. But the echoes of those decades, the hope, The fear, the rivalry, and the triumph still resonate every time a rocket lifts off and every time an astronaut gazes down at the tiny blue marble below. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 ended decades of geopolitical rivalry that had defined much of the 20th century. For the space programs of the United States and Russia, these events opened an unprecedented opportunity to transform competition into collaboration. The space race, which had once been a ruthless contest to dominate Earth's orbit and beyond, was giving way to a new chapter, one in which astronauts from former enemies would work side by side in orbit, advancing science and human exploration as partners rather than adversaries. This change was neither sudden nor easy. Both NASA and the Russian space program Roscosmos had grown accustomed to operating in isolation, each with their own technology, culture, and ambitions. Political tensions, budget pressures, and mutual suspicion lingered, even as leaders publicly embraced cooperation. Yet the vision of a joint space station was compelling. It promised to combine the best capabilities of both nations, foster diplomatic goodwill, and provide a stable platform for research, technology development, and long-term human habitation in space. The idea of an international space station was not new. In fact, the concept had been floated during the Cold War itself, but geopolitical realities and financial constraints had kept it out of reach. The US had its space shuttle and plans for space stations like Skylab, while the Soviet Union had its Salyut and Mir programs. Each side had achieved milestones independently, but the cost and complexity of maintaining long-term orbital outposts were enormous. Collaboration offered a way to share expenses and expertise. The early 1990s marked a critical period for space policy. NASA's Space Shuttle program was in full swing, flying numerous missions to deploy satellites and service scientific instruments like the Hubble Space Telescope. Russia was managing the aging Mir space station, which had become a hub for increasingly ambitious missions lasting months, testing human endurance in microgravity. As the Cold War faded, political leaders sought new frameworks for engagement, and space emerged as a natural arena for building trust. Negotiations to establish a joint space station began in earnest in the early 1990s. Initial talks between NASA and the Russian Space Agency focused on sharing resources and capabilities. The United States would provide the shuttle and key scientific modules, while Russia would contribute experience with long-duration missions, life support systems, and Soyuz spacecraft to ferry astronauts to and from orbit. One of the most significant breakthroughs came with the 1993 agreement to integrate the U.S. Space Station Freedom Project with the Russian Mir-2 program and contributions from Europe, Japan, and Canada, resulting in the International Space Station program as it is known today. This fusion of disparate plans was unprecedented and required extensive diplomatic and engineering coordination. Each partner brought its own technical standards, languages, and bureaucracies to the table, making the process slow and often contentious. The resulting ISS design is modular, a sprawling complex of pressurized modules, solar arrays, docking ports, and laboratories that can be expanded and reconfigured over time. Modules from the United States, Russia, Europe, via the European Space Agency, Japan, and Canada were launched over the course of 2 decades and assembled in orbit through hundreds of shuttle missions and Russian launches. The station's location, roughly 250 miles above Earth, keeps it close enough for regular crew exchanges and cargo deliveries, but far enough to experience the harsh realities of space, microgravity, radiation, and extreme temperature fluctuations. In November 1998, the first 2 modules were launched: the Russian Zarya, a functional cargo and control module, and the U.S. Unity, a connecting node. The station grew piece by piece as astronauts and cosmonauts conducted spacewalks in the vacuum of orbit to attach new segments, install systems, and outfit laboratories. The ISS quickly became a symbol of a new era. It was the first time humans from multiple nations worked continuously in space together. The crews were multinational teams, living and working in cramped quarters for months at a time, conducting experiments ranging from biology to physics, Earth observation to space medicine. Their efforts advanced our understanding of how humans adapt to long-term spaceflight, vital knowledge for any future missions beyond Earth orbit. The station also became a diplomatic platform. Astronauts and cosmonauts forged friendships and mutual respect, transcending the geopolitical tensions that remained on Earth. Joint missions, cross-training, and shared successes helped build trust between nations, showing that cooperation in space could be a force for peace and progress. Behind the scenes, the technical and logistical challenges were immense. The ISS is effectively a giant, complex machine hurtling at nearly 17,000 miles per hour, orbiting Earth every 90 minutes. Keeping it running requires constant maintenance, repairs, and resupply. Launch vehicles ferry food, equipment, and scientific instruments to orbit, while older systems are upgraded or replaced. The risks are high hardware failures, power outages, or a collision with space debris could endanger the crew and station integrity. The crews themselves endure physical and psychological challenges. Microgravity causes muscle atrophy and bone density loss. Cosmic radiation poses health risks. Isolation and confinement test mental resilience. Astronauts spend hours each day exercising to combat physical decline, perform complex scientific work, and handle station upkeep. The small living space demands cooperation and diplomacy among international crews. Despite these challenges, the ISS has remained continuously inhabited since November 1998, a remarkable milestone in human spaceflight history. It stands as a testament to decades of technological innovation and international collaboration. The research conducted aboard the station has led to advances in medicine, materials science, Earth observation, and more. The ISS program also highlighted the shifting nature of space exploration in the post-Cold War era. No longer a race to outdo an adversary, space became a place for joint ventures involving governments and private industry. Commercial companies began developing cargo services and eventually crewed flights to the station. This transition has opened new frontiers for exploration and commerce. Moreover, the station has inspired a new generation of scientists, engineers, and explorers worldwide. Its presence in the night sky reminds us of humanity's capacity to work together toward common goals, transcending borders and ideologies. It is a laboratory, a home, and a symbol, a beacon of what is possible when cooperation replaces competition. Yet the story of the ISS also raises questions for the future. How long can the station be maintained? What comes next for human spaceflight? Will cooperation continue as new players China, India, private companies enter the arena? And how will the lessons learned on this orbiting laboratory shape humanity's next giant steps toward the Moon, Mars, and beyond? For decades, space exploration had been an enterprise dominated and defined by governments. The space race was not only a contest of technology, but a demonstration of political will and national prestige. NASA, the Soviet space program, the European Space Agency, Roscosmos, and others functioned as extensions of state power. Rocket launches were often televised national events. Astronauts were ambassadors of ideology, and budgets were tied closely to the priorities of geopolitics. But as the Cold War waned and technology matured, a new player emerged: the private sector. What began as small, ambitious startups with limited resources gradually transformed into an industry capable of launching spacecraft, ferrying astronauts, and even dreaming of colonizing Mars. The rise of private spaceflight represents a profound shift, not just in who goes to space, but in how humanity approaches the cosmos itself. The roots of commercial spaceflight trace back to the post-Apollo period, when NASA and others began contracting private companies for satellite launches and cargo delivery. But these efforts were largely incremental and operated under government oversight. The real change came in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when new entrepreneurs, inspired by the spirit of exploration and driven by vision and venture capital, sought to disrupt the status quo. One of the earliest pioneers was SpaceX, founded in 2002 by Elon Musk. Musk, a South African-born entrepreneur who had made fortunes in software and internet ventures, set out with a bold mission: to reduce the cost of space travel dramatically and make human life multiplanetary. At a time when NASA's shuttle was aging and spaceflight remained prohibitively expensive, SpaceX offered a new approach, developing reusable rockets, starting with the Falcon 1 and eventually the Falcon 9. Reusability was a game changer. Traditional rockets were single-use vehicles. After launching their payloads, their components fell back to Earth and were lost. SpaceX invested heavily in designing boosters that could land vertically and be reflown. This approach promised to slash costs and increase launch cadence. However, early tests were fraught with failure. Multiple launches of Falcon 1 failed before achieving orbit. Persistence paid off in September 2008, when Falcon 1 successfully reached orbit, marking the first privately developed liquid-fueled rocket to do so. From that moment, the pace accelerated rapidly. SpaceX secured contracts with NASA to deliver cargo to the International Space Station, a task previously reserved for government spacecraft. By 2012, the company's Dragon capsule successfully berthed with the ISS, a landmark moment in commercial spaceflight. Meanwhile, other private companies entered the field. Blue Origin, founded by Jeff Bezos in 2000, focused on suborbital tourism with its New Shepard vehicle, aiming to open space to civilians. Virgin Galactic, under Richard Branson, pursued a similar vision, using air-launched spaceplanes. These ventures signaled a shift from purely scientific or governmental goals to commercial and tourism ambitions. At the same time, traditional aerospace giants Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman remained key players, often collaborating with these newcomers. Public-private partnerships became the norm. NASA's Commercial Crew Program, initiated in the early 2010s, contracted private firms to develop crewed spacecraft, ending America's reliance on Russian Soyuz vehicles for ISS access. This commercial wave was not without risks. The technical challenges of rocket development, spacecraft design, and human spaceflight are enormous. Early failures could have bankrupted companies and damaged reputations. Yet the competition and innovation also drove rapid advances. SpaceX's successful landing of Falcon 9 boosters, the Crew Dragon's first crewed mission in 2020, and the development of Starship, the fully reusable spacecraft designed for deep space, are milestones demonstrating private spaceflight's growing maturity. The rise of private spaceflight also brought new challenges around regulation, space traffic management, and international cooperation, launching thousands of satellites for internet constellations, as companies like SpaceX's Starlink have done, raises concerns about orbital debris and light pollution. The traditional frameworks for space governance, built for a handful of government actors, are being tested and revised. Beyond Earth orbit, private ambitions grow bolder. Companies plan lunar landers and robotic missions to the Moon and Mars, aiming to pave the way for human settlement. Concepts like asteroid mining and space manufacturing are moving from speculative ideas to funded projects. The idea that space is not just a domain for exploration, but a new economic frontier is taking hold. Yet the human element remains central. Private spaceflight is making astronauts out of civilians, researchers, and tourists. It promises to democratize access to space, once limited to a handful of government-selected individuals. The stories of private astronauts, both professional and amateur, add new chapters to humanity's ongoing story among the stars. As this new commercial era unfolds, it is natural to reflect on the journey from the first tentative Soviet and American launches to a future where space is open to many actors. The race between nations has evolved into a race of innovation, and entrepreneurship. And while governments still play vital roles, the cosmos is increasingly a place where private initiative shapes what is possible. What does this mean for the future of space exploration? Will private companies lead the charge to Mars? Will they build space habitats, mine asteroids, or even terraform other worlds? And how will the international community ensure that this new frontier is governed responsibly and peacefully? The answers are still being written. But one thing is certain: the rise of private spaceflight marks a profound turning point in humanity's relationship with the stars. For much of the 20th century, the space race was a binary contest. The United States on one side, the Soviet Union on the other. The two superpowers' rivalry shaped not only technology and geopolitics, but also the popular imagination. But as the Cold War faded into history, new nations quietly built their own space programs, setting the stage for a multipolar era of space exploration. Among these new entrants, the People's Republic of China stands out as the most ambitious and methodical. Its ascent to becoming a major space power is the result of decades of careful planning, vast investment, and the strategic integration of military, scientific, and economic goals. The story of China's space program reveals a nation seeking not just technological parity, but leadership in the 21st century's final frontier. China's space ambitions date back to the mid-20th century, but progress was initially slow. The country's early years were marked by political upheaval, economic hardship, and limited technological infrastructure. However, beginning in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Chinese government launched a deliberate push to develop its aerospace industry, spurred by a broader program of modernization. The Chinese space program is overseen by the China National Space Administration, CNSA, which works alongside military branches and scientific institutions. Unlike NASA or Roscosmos, which evolved from Cold War origins, the CNSA was founded with a strong focus on integrating civil and military objectives. The dual-use nature of many space technologies reflects China's strategic emphasis on both defense and development. China's first major breakthrough came with the launch of its first satellite, Dongfang Hong 1, The East is Red, on April 24, 1970, aboard a Long March 1 rocket. This milestone established China as the fifth nation to independently launch a satellite, after the USSR, the USA, France, and Japan. It was a statement of technical capability, but also a symbol of national pride. From there, China steadily expanded its launch vehicle program. The Long March family of rockets grew more capable, reliable, and sophisticated, carrying a range of satellites into orbit for communications, navigation, Earth observation, and scientific purposes. Alongside these robotic missions, China developed human spaceflight capabilities. The Shenzhou program represents China's effort to put astronauts known as taikonauts into orbit. The first crewed Shenzhou mission, Shenzhou 5, launched in October 2003, made China the third country to independently send humans into space. Yang Liwei, the mission's sole astronaut, orbited Earth 14 times during a 21-hour mission, becoming a national hero overnight. Following this success, China pursued increasingly ambitious human spaceflight missions. Shenzhou 6 and 7 carried multi-person crews and included China's first spacewalk, performed by Zhaiji Gang in September 2008. These missions demonstrated not just technological achievement, but also the training, infrastructure, and operational maturity necessary for sustained human presence in space. China's ambitions extended beyond short-duration missions. Unlike the United States and Russia, which had built large space stations during the Cold War era, China entered the arena later, but with a clear eye toward creating its own orbital laboratory. After a series of small experimental satellites and space labs, China launched Tiangong-1 in September 2013, the country's first space station module. Tiangong-1 served as a testbed for rendezvous and docking technologies, allowing Chinese spacecraft to autonomously approach and attach to the station. These capabilities are critical for building larger stations and eventually supporting crews for longer stays. China continued with Tiangong-2 and most recently, the Tiangong Modular Space Station, planned for full assembly by the mid-2020s. The Tiangong program reflects a strategic decision by China to build independent space infrastructure rather than rely on existing facilities like the ISS, which China has been barred from joining due to US political restrictions. The station's design includes multiple pressurized modules, life support systems, robotic arms, and research laboratories supporting a range of scientific fields, from biology to materials science. China has also expanded its robotic exploration efforts, sending rovers to the Moon and Mars. The Chang'e lunar program includes orbiters, landers, rovers, and sample return missions, achieving the first soft landing on the Moon's far side in January 2019. The Tianwen-1 Mars mission, launched in July 2020, successfully deployed a rover on Mars in May 2021, making China the first nation to orbit, land, and operate a rover on Mars on its initial attempt. China's growing space capabilities are inseparable from its broader geopolitical ambitions. Space technology underpins military systems such as missile guidance, reconnaissance, and communications. Space is also a domain of strategic competition, with concerns about satellite vulnerability and anti-satellite weapons. China's rapid development reflects its desire to secure a dominant position in these domains. But the Chinese government also emphasizes peaceful uses of space and scientific progress. National pride, economic development, and international prestige drive the program's public narrative. China has launched numerous satellites for global positioning, Beidou system, weather monitoring, environmental observation, and telecommunications. It also participates in international scientific cooperation, sharing data and engaging in joint missions. China's rise in space raises important questions about the future global order beyond Earth. The ISS partnership, largely excluding China, reflects lingering geopolitical divides. Meanwhile, China's independent efforts demonstrate an alternative path, a reminder that space is not a monolithic domain controlled by a single alliance or ideology. As China prepares to expand its space station, pursue crewed lunar missions, and develop advanced propulsion and exploration technologies, the international community watches closely. Will China's approach foster new forms of collaboration or deepen rivalries? How will global governance adapt to a more multipolar space environment? China's ascent is a powerful chapter in the ongoing story of humanity's reach beyond Earth. It shows how space remains a place where technology, ambition, and geopolitics intersect. The narrative is still unfolding, but China's role is already reshaping the contours of the space age. The Moon, Earth's constant companion in the night sky, has captivated human imagination for millennia. When Apollo astronauts first set foot on its dusty surface in 1969, they fulfilled a dream that had seemed impossible. Yet, since the last Apollo mission in 1972, no human has walked there again. For decades, the Moon was left to robotic probes and distant observation, while attention shifted elsewhere. Now, in the 21st century, the Moon is once again at the center of human space ambitions. But this time, the goal is not just a brief visit. Instead, space agencies and private companies envision sustainable exploration, permanent bases, and a stepping stone to Mars and beyond. The story of returning to the Moon is about overcoming old challenges and embracing new technologies, partnerships, and visions. The decision to return humans to the lunar surface is rooted in both practical and symbolic reasons. The Moon serves as a natural laboratory for understanding planetary science, the origins of the solar system, and even clues about Earth's own history. Its low gravity and proximity make it an ideal testbed for technologies that will be essential for longer missions, such as those to Mars. Furthermore, the Moon holds resources like water ice in permanently shadowed craters that could be crucial for sustaining human presence and fueling spacecraft. NASA's Artemis program, announced in the late 2010s, represents America's official effort to lead this new lunar era. Named after Apollo's twin sister in Greek mythology, Artemis seeks not only to land astronauts on the Moon, but to establish a long-term presence by the mid-2020s. This program aims to send the first woman and the next man to the lunar surface, a milestone that reflects changing times and broader inclusion. The Artemis missions build upon lessons learned from Apollo, but incorporate modern advancements. Unlike Apollo's rapid, high-risk campaign, Artemis emphasizes sustainability, international cooperation, and commercial partnerships. The Gateway, a planned lunar orbiting station, will serve as a staging point for surface missions, facilitating communication, crew transfer, and scientific research. This orbital outpost reflects a shift in approach. Instead of a direct flight from Earth to the Moon and back, a multi-step process will extend operational flexibility and safety. International partners including Canada, Europe, and Japan have joined Artemis, each contributing modules, robotics, or scientific instruments. This collaboration echoes the spirit of the International Space Station, recognizing that space exploration benefits from pooling resources and expertise. Meanwhile, private companies have secured contracts to develop lunar landers and habitat technologies, marking a new era of commercial involvement in planetary exploration. One of the greatest challenges for sustained lunar presence is the harsh environment. The Moon's surface experiences extreme temperature, swings from blistering heat during the day to freezing cold at night, and lacks a protective atmosphere, exposing inhabitants to cosmic radiation and micrometeorites. Developing habitats that can shield astronauts and provide life support is a major engineering focus. Concepts range from inflatable modules covered with lunar regolith for radiation protection to underground bases carved into lava tubes, leveraging natural shelter. Water ice discovered at the lunar poles is a key resource. It can be mined and processed into drinking water, breathable oxygen, and hydrogen fuel. The potential to produce rocket fuel on the Moon, a concept called in situ resource utilization, could revolutionize space travel by allowing spacecraft to refuel before heading deeper into the solar system. This reduces the massive cost and complexity of launching all fuel from Earth. China, too, has announced ambitious lunar plans, aiming to establish robotic and crewed bases, pursue scientific experiments, and demonstrate capabilities for long-duration missions. Their Chang'e program successes have demonstrated sophisticated robotic exploration, including sample return missions. China's plans for lunar research stations could alter the geopolitical landscape of space, challenging established powers and encouraging new collaborations or rivalries. Private companies are also eyeing the Moon. Ventures like SpaceX envision using their Starship vehicle for lunar transport, while startups are exploring mining operations, communications infrastructure, and tourism. These ambitions reflect a fundamental shift. The Moon is no longer just a scientific or nationalistic goal, but a potential economic and strategic asset. As the world prepares for humanity's return to the Moon, the lessons of past missions remain vital. Apollo astronauts faced immense risks, relying on early technology and daring ingenuity. Today's explorers benefit from decades of accumulated knowledge, but face new challenges: political will, international coordination, budget constraints, and technical complexity. Moreover, the Moon's return invites reflection on humanity's place in the cosmos. The Apollo missions inspired generations, yet also reminded us of Earth's fragility. The famous Earthrise photograph captured during Apollo 8 changed how we see our planet. The renewed lunar effort may rekindle that sense of wonder and responsibility. Will this new chapter lead to permanent settlements, to the Moon becoming humanity's first true off-world home? Or will it be a stepping stone to bolder journeys to Mars and beyond? How will space law, ethics, and international agreements adapt to these new realities? The answers remain open, awaiting the footprints of the explorers to come. The red planet has captured human imagination for centuries, its reddish glow visible in the night sky, a symbol of mystery and possibility. Mars is more than just a distant world. It represents the next great leap for human exploration, a place where we might one day live, work, and perhaps even thrive beyond Earth. But the journey to Mars is fraught with challenges both technical and human. Unlike the Moon, which is just a few days away, Mars lies millions of miles from Earth. Travel there requires months in space, advanced life support systems, and the ability to operate independently from Earth's immediate help. The stakes are high, but so is the potential reward. Understanding Mars's history, its potential for past or present life, and the broader question of humanity's place in the cosmos. The interest in Mars surged in the mid-20th century as early space probes sent back tantalizing images of its surface. Features that looked like dried riverbeds, polar ice caps, and varying seasons suggested a dynamic planet, perhaps once warm and wet. Early missions like Mariner, Viking, and later rovers provided data that fueled hopes and hypotheses about habitability. Despite this, the technical and physiological challenges of crewed Mars missions are immense. The round-trip journey can take 2 to 3 years, with 6 to 9 months of transit each way. Astronauts face prolonged exposure to cosmic radiation, muscle atrophy and microgravity, and psychological isolation. The communication delay up to 22 minutes one way means real-time control from Earth is impossible. To prepare for these challenges, space agencies and researchers have conducted simulations and developed technologies. NASA's Mars Exploration Program and the European Space Agency's collaborations have tested habitats, robotics, and life support on Earth and in orbit. The International Space Station has served as a platform to study long-duration human spaceflight's effects. Rovers like Spirit, Opportunity, Curiosity, and Perseverance have explored Mars's surface extensively, analyzing soil, rocks, and atmosphere. Perseverance's successful collection of rock samples for eventual return to Earth is a milestone, laying the groundwork for future science. Additionally, the Ingenuity helicopter demonstrated powered flight in Mars's thin atmosphere, opening new possibilities for aerial exploration. The goal of sending humans to Mars has been embraced by government agencies and private companies alike. NASA's Artemis program is seen as a stepping stone, developing technologies and experience needed for deep space missions. SpaceX, under Elon Musk, has made public plans for Starship, a fully reusable spacecraft designed to carry large crews and cargo to Mars. Musk's vision is to establish a self-sustaining city on Mars, arguing that humanity must become a multiplanetary species to ensure its survival. Critics caution about the ethical, environmental, and practical challenges, noting that Mars's environment is harsh, resources are limited, and colonization efforts may take decades or centuries. Mars exploration raises profound questions beyond technology. What are the ethical responsibilities of humans visiting another planet? How do we avoid contaminating potential Martian ecosystems? International treaties, like the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, prohibit harmful contamination, but the rapid pace of exploration demands new frameworks. Moreover, Mars missions will test human resilience. Astronauts must contend with physical dangers, isolation, and psychological stresses. Success depends on training, teamwork, and robust support systems. The experience gained on the ISS and lunar missions provides valuable lessons, but Mars will be an unprecedented challenge. As we stand on the threshold of Martian exploration, the planet remains both a beacon of hope and a reminder of our limitations. Will humans set foot on Mars within the next decades? What will the first settlers find? Will they discover signs of ancient life, or merely a barren landscape? How will Mars shape humanity's future as a frontier of survival, science, or spirit? The answers remain unknown, inviting all of us to watch, wonder, and participate in this unfolding chapter of history. Space exploration is more than rockets, astronauts, and distant worlds. It's a reflection of humanity's enduring curiosity, resilience, and drive to push beyond the known. From the first tentative steps on Earth's orbit to dreams of colonizing other planets, space has been a canvas where our hopes and fears, achievements and failures are writ large. The story of space is also a story of people, scientists, engineers, visionaries, and everyday individuals whose work often went unnoticed but laid the foundation for historic leaps. It is in the details, years of meticulous research, countless trials, failures, and incremental progress that the true essence of exploration resides. This quiet perseverance is the backbone of every launch, every mission, every discovery. The geopolitical struggles of the 20th century gave space a dual character, a battlefield of ideologies and a beacon of unity. The Cold War space race spurred rapid advances, but also reflected deep divisions. Yet, the collaborative spirit of the International Space Station and recent international missions show that space can bridge divides, fostering cooperation in the face of shared challenges. Technological innovation driven by space programs has transformed daily life on Earth in unexpected ways. Satellite communications, GPS navigation, weather forecasting, medical technologies, and materials science all trace roots to space research. The investment in space exploration has repeatedly delivered returns far beyond initial hopes, illustrating the interwoven nature of science, society, and progress. Looking forward, humanity faces choices. Will space exploration become an inclusive endeavor, involving nations and peoples across the globe? Will we develop sustainable and ethical approaches that respect both celestial bodies and each other? Or will competition and exploitation create new conflicts beyond Earth? The framework of space law, governance, and ethics remains a work in progress, challenged by rapid technological change and expanding ambitions. Ultimately, space exploration asks us to reconsider what it means to be human. The perspective gained from viewing Earth as a fragile, interconnected whole reminds us of our responsibilities. The quest for knowledge and survival beyond our planet speaks to a deep-rooted instinct to explore, adapt, and endure. As new generations prepare to venture beyond our world, they carry the legacy of those who came before and the hopes of those who will follow. What will be the next great discovery? How will the stories of those yet to come redefine our place in the cosmos? The future remains unwritten, inviting you, the listener, to imagine, reflect, and perhaps one day become part of this extraordinary journey.